Hello, everyone, and welcome to this international seminar on continued violence in Afghanistan and regional geopolitical implications of the US withdrawal organized by Tillotoma Foundation. I'm Soham Das, Director of Tillotoma Foundation. Tillotoma Foundation is a global think tank working in the areas of international relations, area studies, financial, environmental, scientific, strategic, and defense policy. Today's distinguished speakers are Dr. Habiba Sarabi, former Minister of Afghanistan, former Governor of the Bamyan province, and member of the Afghan Peace Negotiation Team. We also have with us Ambassador Amar Sinha, former Secretary, Ministry of External Affairs, India, former Ambassador of India to Afghanistan, former member of the National Security Advisory Board of India. Ambassador Vijay Nambiar, former Indian Permanent Representative to the United Nations and former Ambassador of India to Afghanistan. Dr. Barnett R. Rubin, former Senior Advisor to the Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan in the US Department of State and leading expert on Afghanistan and South Asia. Dr. Nilofer Sakhi, Director of Diplomacy and Policy, Macomb and Company, Professorial Lecturer, George Washington University's Elliott School of International Affairs, Non-Resident Senior Fellow, Atlantic Council. We also have with us Mr. Ahmad Shuja Jamal, Director General, Office of the National Security Council of Afghanistan. So without further ado, let me invite Dr. Habiba Sarabi to kindly make her address.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Good morning and good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thank you for the Tillotoma Foundation for making this opportunity to talk about the withdrawal of the U.S. troop from Afghanistan, which is very timely and very critical in this circumstances. And the U.S. withdrawal already started and will be finished by the 11th of September. And all the speakers, I'm sure that they will talk deeply on the outcome of this withdrawal. Let me to go back on 20 years back and to talk a little bit that the aim and the goal of the U.S. troop came to Afghanistan. I had, excuse me, I had some conversation with in Istanbul with Professor Rubin, but still I'm back to my position. The aim of and the goal of U.S. when they came to Afghanistan, one was that one of the goal was to fight for terrorism. So of course, defeat the Taliban from Afghanistan because of this 11th of September event happened, and the Taliban had connection with Al Qaeda and terrorism. That's why one of the main object and goal was the fighting with the terrorism and Al Qaeda. And also their aim was that Afghanistan cannot be the haven of the terrorists that can be the U.S. can be attacked from Afghanistan, and to support democracy, human rights, and women's rights. 20 years back, I want to discuss a little bit about this issue. The U.S. came for to fight for terrorism. Do we think that terrorism is finished in Afghanistan or exists, but still the terrorism is functioning in Afghanistan and functioning in Afghanistan, even expanding more to in some other countries. The opposite that did you hear me before?
Yes, we did.
Okay. So on the U.S. and Taliban agreement, there was one item that Taliban should finish their link or their relation with Al Qaeda and terrorist group. But recent report from UN shows that still Taliban has a relation with Al-Qaeda and terrorist group. This is something that many reports are showing that. And also, Afghanistan now became the center of the extremist group. Not only Afghanistan, but our neighboring country, Pakistan, was the place for the extremists, and also including Afghanistan. It's the heaven for the Ifratiyat or extremist group that expand the extremism to other country. The second item of the agreement between the US and Taliban was about the violence, to decrease the violence in Afghanistan. But unfortunately, the violence is day by day increasing, and civilians are killing, and it's especially the target killing is one of the a major issue in Afghanistan. Not only the military or the people who are working with the government, but the civilian, the journalists, human rights and women's rights activists, and also targeting the school, the education center, the specific ethnic group. These are the violence that Taliban are committing for that. So with the increasing the violence every day, day by day, the human rights and women's rights are violating. The Taliban are trying to stop the voice of the people, or killing the people that they have the voice. For example, the journalist, of course, is one of the biggest target for Taliban. The women activists and also the civil society, because they have the voice. The Taliban mostly want to stop their voice, or to shut them down, not to have a voice. So in conclusion, when the United States had the goal or the aim to come to Afghanistan to stop, to fight the terrorism and stop the terrorism, and also support the democracy and human rights and women's rights, none of them happened within this 20 years. I don't want to go deeply on the reason behind these issues, but of course it needs a little bit more investigation, more analysis. I'm sure that many scholars are here that they can do these analyze that what were the reason behind everything that they have done it. So I want to point that unfortunately, Afghanistan is the experiment of this superpower to want to experiment their weapon in Afghanistan. One day, Soviet Union came here, and the United States supported all the Mujahideen group and different other jihadi group against the Soviet Union. But today, and they left, and they had a kind of agreement with the two superpowers, the US and the Soviet Union. They had the agreement, and after that, they left Afghanistan alone. But I want to mention that please keep keep in your mind, and also remember, of course, we are very grateful. We are very grateful from the people of the United States, whom they lost their children, their sons, their brothers, and their husband in Afghanistan. We appreciate their sacrifice, but we have to keep in our mind that, and also the international community, and especially US, that we also sacrificed for that. If the sacrifice of the Afghan people were not there, believe me that there were, for every gate of the Pakistani people, there were a Soviet Union soldier, and they could come very easily to the warm water of Indian Ocean very, very easily. So that's why it was the sacrifice of the Afghan people. They have been sacrificed for that. They also suffered to. It was a kind of giant. A giant mission that we started together. We have to finish together. So I recommend that this, of course, withdrawal can be happen. And when we had a conference or a meeting in Istanbul, Professor Rubin said that U.S. troops will leave Afghanistan. Of course, we don't want the U.S. troop can stay forever in Afghanistan, but at least it can be responsible. The international community and also the U.S. should keep supporting the military force in Afghanistan. Also, all the aid and support can be conditional based for the human rights, women's rights, and at the same time put pressure to the regional country, especially Pakistan, to push Taliban for meaningful negotiation at the table, because most of the time that the Taliban are escaping from the table, not ready for the meaningful and real negotiation, and wanted to just save the time and waiting for the last soldier of the U.S. Go out from Afghanistan. I want to stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sarabi. It's such a pleasure to have you here. So thank you so much for your insightful address, and we hope to have you again on future occasions as well. Thank you so much for joining this conference and for your experience and for your incredible work in Afghanistan. Thank you so much. We now have with us a very senior diplomat with decades of experience, Ambassador Vijay Nambiar, who has been the permanent representative of India to the United Nations, as well as former ambassador of India to Afghanistan. So, Ambassador Nambiar, the floor is yours. Please unmute yourself.
Can you hear me now?
Now.
Oh.
Yes.
Well, thank you very much. I'd like to thank the Tillotoma Foundation for giving me this opportunity to be present to hear most of you. As far as I'm concerned, I'm in a sense a has-been, because I was ambassador almost 30 years ago in Kabul during the period of 1990 to end of 1992. I was, in fact, in close touch with President Najibullah during the early months of 1992, especially in April, when the UN had decided to airlift him out of Kabul. I was perhaps the last non-UN diplomat to speak to him on the phone before his departure, and also the first to meet him after the botch-up at Kabul airport, which forced him into the UN compound. In the subsequent weeks, as the Dean of the Diplomatic Corps in Kabul, at a time when engineer Gulbuddin Hekmatyar was bombing Kabul from outside the city, it was my responsibility to arrange the expatriation of diplomatic families, wives and children out of Kabul. Even while the Prime Minister of Afghanistan was violating the words given by his government and bombing his own airport. This was perhaps among the most anxious moments of my entire diplomatic career. There is much talk today about the similarity of the situation of Kabul immediately preceding the Mujahideen entry in April 1992 with that of today. There is also a great interest in the reconciliation ideas mooted then by President Najibullah, including that of an interim authority to take power in Afghanistan to ensure a peaceful transition. The fact is that despite all the discussions of transitional political proposals after President Najib's offer to resign in March 1992, neither the Watan Party nor the Mujahideen adhered to the arrangements worked out by Benon Sevan. Najib was forcibly prevented from leaving the country, but the frantic Mujahideen rushed to Kabul, though it resulted in the establishment of a Mujahideen government under Mujaddidi. Rival factions took over different parts of the city and caused prolonged confusion and instability. A similar scenario obviously cannot be ruled out if the Taliban were to try to take over the reins of government in Kabul in the days and weeks following the US military withdrawal. That quite clearly could happen unless the international community is able to take coherent action to avert such a development. But today, the credibility of the United States is badly shaken. As Ambassador Ryan Crocker stated recently, by accepting the Doha Accords, actually the US has effectively given up Afghanistan, almost like they did Vietnam with the Paris Accords. While historically the justification for military action in 20 years ago was to ensure that Afghanistan would never be used again as a staging post for attacks to the US homeland, obviously this withdrawal does not assure them that there will be no future attacks. After spending more than $2 trillion, according to the New York Times, and only less than 0.25% being used to improve the lives of local population, and losing huge amounts of lives, both of local civilians as well as US military, the US now seems to have left the battle space to their adversaries who, as Crocker says, are smarter, tougher, and more committed than they were more than 2 generations ago. So, as we see, the US has sent a clear signal that these talks were not about peace, but more about surrender. The ability of the Afghan security forces to maintain effective pressure on the Taliban has become questionable. And all the various actors, apart from the current Afghan government, the civil society, the active civil society, the UN and international NGOs, which have been operating in the country, I think the question of their future operation becomes highly questionable. What is the prognosis? Now, there can be little doubt that any political process, if it is to succeed in Afghanistan, will have to be homegrown and based on local ground realities, even though it will indispensably need external support in order to survive. But while the Bonn process saw the emergence of Karzai as a Pashtun leader of standing, the process failed eventually because it remained completely subordinate to the external agenda dictated by the US. The Afghan government could neither build stable institutions of governance nor convince the rival Mujahideen factions to give up their private armies and transform themselves into political parties. This dilemma, I think, remains even today. Today, it would seem that the choice is essentially between an Islamic emirate and an Islamic republic. And of course, what kind of external support will anchor this new government? Now, obviously, we know the countries that have earlier, which have supported the Taliban, would probably not be able to oppose directly an emirate structure. The question will be, will the US be able to assert itself substantially in an inter-Afghan process at this stage when it is withdrawing militarily? One understands that it would like to initiate a UN-led process. Will this process follow the familiar lines of the past, or will there be something new? One doesn't know, quite frankly. Meanwhile, the Russians have initiated a Moscow mechanism, which is obviously they cannot move unilaterally, but they're trying to pursue it multilaterally. China has also indicated its intent to facilitate an intra-Afghan talks to provide necessary conditions for negotiation in China. Therefore, we may be seeing a new constellation of forces emerging amidst this jockeying between the US and its allies on one hand, and Russia, China, and its friends and partner countries on the other, to anchor a new process that will build a new basis for political change in Afghanistan. Now, what shape will such a process take? China's foreign ministry has talked about a durable, comprehensive peace in Afghanistan to prevent another war. And it says that such peace is only possible under the framework of the Constitution and the Islamic Republic system. Now, both Russia and China have had a series of contacts, however, with the Taliban over the past months. The Taliban has visited both Beijing and Moscow. And both these countries are keen to reduce the influence of the US in Afghanistan. But they're also, I'm sure, also equally aware that there is a critical need not to allow any erosion of the capacities and infrastructure of the Afghan security forces, because that would prevent them from tackling emergent terrorist threats of ISIS and others, expanding into Central Asia and probably into China as well as Russia. Now, added to this broader is the broader agenda of the Chinese agenda of extending BRI initiatives in the sub-region. We are also hearing noises within the Pakistani military establishment of the need for Islamabad to adopt an overall geo-economic approach to the region. Now, obviously, Pakistan is looking at Afghanistan from a kind of Chinese-oriented perspective of the broader ramifications of infrastructure projects linking Central Asia and Pakistan through Afghanistan. Obviously, Pakistan continues to harp on building its ties with China and with Afghanistan in the context of enhancing its strategic depth and to ensure that India is excluded from any political process. And Pakistan, however, I think, is realistic enough to realize that a future, even a Taliban-led Afghan government or an Afghan government which has Taliban participation is not likely to agree to subordinate its own national priorities to those of Pakistan. It is clear also that given the weak foundations of public finance within the country and the continued stagnation of the domestic economy, the government in Kabul will have to depend substantially on external funding. If China were to take the lead in taking forward a political process, it will also have to be expected to provide financial support to the government. Now, whether or not China would be prepared to make such a wide commitment remains to be seen. Also, it remains to be seen how long this dependence will last. But political commentators in China have been talking about China's economic support is needed not only to strengthen Afghanistan's weary economy, but also to reduce its dependence on Western and US aid. Now, Beijing has participated in various initiatives and meetings, obviously, even the last few days. It is also keen on tackling this issue in the framework of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. China has also publicly asserted the convergence of its interests with those of Pakistan and said that Pakistan plays a very important role in Afghanistan. China has also been very careful to make its own security-related preparations by beefing up its military capacities near Wakhan, as well as in seeking a possible base in Tajikistan. Beijing has also voiced its concerns regarding security threats to Xinjiang, emanating from the threat of what they call the three evils of terrorism, separatism, and extremism. How will it square the circle in terms of strengthening the structure of support for the present Afghan government while yet providing increased space for the Taliban? Now, to come to India's response, it's quite clear, in my view at least, that we should neither respond defensively nor dismissively to any emergent political process that is coming forward. So long as such a process is Afghan-led and Afghan-owned, we should not shy away from being actively involved in the process. While accepting the rights of the Afghans to govern themselves, we need to be firm in safeguarding our own national interests and to ensure that this process is not working to an extraneous agenda or is directed in terms of securities to countries outside Afghanistan. I do not see India as unwilling to build new equities, what my colleague once called it, new equities. But I think we will take into account how far the current leaders of Afghanistan in the current government are able to work out accommodations consistent with its constitution and the system while they reach out to these new elements. But as far as the Taliban elements now emerging in the political landscape are concerned, or re-emerging, India should not forget, I think, our experience of previous years with the Taliban. In the past, Indian missions in both Kabul and Mazar have been targeted. Of course, we can hardly forget the experience of the hijacking of the Indian Airlines to Kandahar in 1999. But at the same time, we do need to recognize that if we want to protect our fundamental interests in Afghanistan, we must be willing to accept the reality of some kind of a Taliban presence in the future political life, if it can contribute through an independent government in Kabul, and if credible assurances are provided to respect Indian diplomatic space. I think India has generally played a constructive and positive role both bilaterally as well as in regional fora with regard to Afghanistan. And I think we can be expected to do the same in the future. The people and government of Afghanistan are fully aware of it. And I see, and therefore I'm confident that irrespective of what eventual concatenation of forces take place in Kabul, Afghanistan's leaders will speak out forthrightly and with an independent voice to reaffirm their strong relationship with India in the future. I think that India should work very, very constructively in any future process, but we see it really as anchored in a discussion with the current government that is taking place in Afghanistan. I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Nambiar. Thank you for being here with us. It was a very insightful presentation. Now we move to Dr. Nilofer Saki, Director of Diplomacy and Policy at Macom & Company and a non-resident senior fellow with the Atlantic Council. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening for everyone joining us from different parts of the world. And a very warm thank you to the organizer, Tillotoma Foundation, for having me here today. But I was asked to reflect on the ongoing violence and the U.S. presence and its impact on the on ongoing violence in Afghanistan. I don't want to go back to last 20 years and what happened last 20 years, though I have my own opinion about it. There were challenges and opportunities that last 20 years of U.S. engagement provided in Afghanistan. Especially, I am very much for the pros and strengths of what the U.S. engagement and involvement brought in Afghanistan from last 20 years, because I consider myself as a product of most of those investment and involvement of U.S. presence in the country. I started work in Afghanistan. I was back and forth during Taliban, but I started work also during in the 2002, and I compare actually 2002 of Afghanistan with today's of Afghanistan, and my analysis based on my comparison of what has been done and what U.S. role was on all those gains and progress that has been made. So I'm not going to touch upon those elements. I'm going to touch upon last 2 years only. I do mapping usually for analyzing better the landscape of conflict in any context. That's where my study background is. So recently I did a background, mapping of the current ongoing violence in Afghanistan. And I looked at the political process. Some of us are calling it the peace process. It started in October of 2018. So I was looking at all the aspects, all the phases of this peace process or ongoing political process. And I saw that the relationship between the violence and the different phases. So that's how I mapped, and I came with some conclusion, maybe not conclusion for others, but conclusion at least from my end, since I did a in-depth mapping from my other papers. So what I found that, yes, violence was there. There were reports from the UN, there were reports from different agencies that highlights on the graphic improvement or graphic progress of violence and non-violence in the country. As I mentioned, my focus was on last 2 years, 2.5 years now, starting from October of 2018. But I observed and I categorized the current political process that the ambassador also highlighted. And I categorized into 2 phases. The first phase was the Doha Agreement, negotiations between the United States and the Taliban. The second phase was I consider as a regional phase, the regional component, where ad hoc meetings of ambassadors and Khalilzad with officials and statements in the region, Afghan state-to-state diplomatic relationships, and conferences in Moscow and Tajikistan, and plans for Turkey, which is not still at the radar. And the third component, I would categorize it as an intra-Afghan process, where it started in Doha, and we have our key negotiator here as well with us. That's the third phase that I categorize. So I saw the impact of each of these phases on the ongoing violence. And I saw a correlation, an extreme close correlation between the 3 phases and the ongoing conflict, and ongoing violence, and the rise in violence, surge in violence, targeting, killing, name it, all kinds of it. The first one, here it is why, what I found. The first one is the entire, I study peace, I study peacemaking, and I look at the different elements of peacemaking. The first is the nature of the negotiation between the United States and the Taliban at the table of negotiation. It strengthened Taliban. It strengthened an insurgent group at the table of negotiation. I mean, looking at all the cases around the world, when at the negotiation table, you strengthen one party, the party will talk from the position of strength, right? And the party uses all the tools in order to have leverage at the table. And Taliban exactly the same. Taliban used violence as a leverage to ask for whatever they demanded, they wanted from the United States. For example, the release of the Taliban's prisoner was the first example. It happened, and whenever there was demand from the Taliban, there was a rise of violence in the country, and that was one element, because there was the factor was strengthening one party at the negotiation table, and that party was the Taliban, obviously. It produces Doha Agreement. All right, Doha Agreement was, for me, I consider it as a facilitating document for intra-Afghan talks, and how I consider the entire agreement. Yeah, there are all the elements that Dr. Sarabi also highlighted on that is still under consideration. But at least the important thing for me, when I see it, it facilitated talk. It started a facilitation of intra-Afghan talk. Taliban never wanted to sit with the Republic, neither during 2010 peace process nor now. But at least that facilitated that. So I consider it as a positive step. But keeping aside all its challenges, I still consider it as a positive step. It facilitated the talks. And what we are saying, all of us, most of us who argue about Afghan war, is there's no solution. There's no military solution to Afghan war. There's only negotiation and dialogues, a political process that can lead Afghanistan towards a peace, and not the military. So therefore, at least for me, looking from that narrative, I see it as a positive step. The second phase. Now coming to the second phase, the regional phase, the ad hoc meetings and the state-to-state diplomatic relationships and the conferences and regionally, they're all the positive elements. Meanwhile, what happened? They on April 14, President Biden announced the U.S. troops withdrawal, starting from May 1st, ending before or by September 11. That was not expected. I mean, the withdrawal was expected for the region and for Afghanistan, but unconditional withdrawal wasn't expected. So that the notion of unconditional withdrawal that actually shaped Afghanistan internal landscape, because I was in touch with many inside Afghanistan, and they were foreseeing the withdrawal, but the unconditional withdrawal, especially from the current administration, was not expected by many. By many, but I mean by grassroots people, even that I was in contact, by community leaders, by the government, by the academia, everyone that I was in contact with, they were kind of saying, really, it was unconditional at this time. But even strengthening Taliban on one hand, that would be a disaster for the country. So that added an instability, a complete mood of instability, and that added another layer of strength to the Taliban's movement. Taliban expanded their, during the political processes, these parties get strength, and that strength empowers them in the battlefield, and empowers them also to leverage more support from the people. And Taliban claimed that after before those agreements and during the process, that they have people support, they have won in the battlefield, and they are now on a very better position. And I think all these announcements and all this the steps in political process that further added to their strength. On the other hand, what happened in the region? That, well, there's a vacuum now. All right, US is leaving, US will leave, and there's a vacuum. There's a vacuum of power. There are the regional actors and players who meddled in Afghanistan conflict. They started meddling more, and by the latest news we have been hearing that there are more insurgencies, different kinds of insurgencies, because most of these targeted attacks are actually not claimed by the Taliban. All right, we don't know the exact story behind, but at least it seems, if it's not obvious, it seems that there are other insurgents group taking shape. It's a transnational terrorist group or not, that's not clear from what I hear from the report and read, but at least there are new insurgent groups taking shape. And new insurgent group means more meddling of the regional countries. So therefore, that power vacuum, the image of power vacuum in the region, that has also added to the ongoing violence in the country, and that expanded Taliban's reach. And the third most important, I think, intra-Afghan process, the United States relationship, a new relationship with Afghan Republic and with Afghanistan in particular. In general, I think that is also creating kind of instability and fear among Afghans that what this relationship will go with unconditional withdrawal. Okay, US will withdraw. There's also decrease, by the way, in the humanitarian and development assistance, the funding that I saw, that there's a decrease in that. So how the financial support will happen, and that also created, that is a political instability actually that created in Kabul, and that political instability has impact on the overall violence in the country, and that also added to another layer to Taliban's strength in the country. So this all three phases overall added to the three phases of the political process, added to the ongoing violence, and added the surge in violence at different level. Now, yes, the targeted killing, there are different analyses about the targeted killing happening in Afghanistan. The analysis I have, and I think it's not mine only, coming from many reports as well, and based on my own experience lived in Afghanistan, Taliban are a conservative body and conservative organization. And they are, though they didn't claim for many of these targeted killings around the country, but everything inside Afghanistan is associated. These targeted killings are associated with the Taliban. Why? Because people have institutional memory from 1996 to 2001. What Taliban did to women's rights, to human rights, to freedom of speech, to overall progress of the society. Though people have also good stories to share from 1996 to 2001, that was security. People used to travel for without any kind of restrictions from places to place inside the country. So, but the institutional memory people have from Taliban's time in 1996, 2001, and the lack of any open statement by the Taliban about their future governance system, about their how they treat all these issues, the liberal values, or I don't know, the progressive ideas and values and initiative that the country had from last 20 years, how they actually deal with all these issues. The lack of clarity, the lack of a plan, the lack of a statement even by them, it has created more instability in the country. That's why all this targeted killing, which are intellectuals, they are killing intellectuals, women rights activists, and journalists, they are associated with the Taliban inside Afghanistan, and are perceived that they are actually, though it's not claimed, but they are done. Why? Because they want to clear the thing, the Taliban perceive and think that the future is theirs. They are they will be empowered, so they kill all, they destroy and kill all those elements who will oppose them while they will be in power. That's one of the analysis. And then another analysis that they certainly might not be supportive of their presence. They might sabotage. They might resist against them. Therefore, it's better to clear the space before their entry. So there are all these kinds of reports and analysis that comes both from the people in Afghanistan and from analysts who write about it and research about it. And now, what actually should go on while addressing the ongoing violence and with the mess that's happening right now at the political sphere of this process? Yes, I completely agree with the peace settlement, with the political settlement. Though we cannot say peace, because if it's peace with the Taliban, we see the emergence of another insurgent groups in the country. So, all right, it means it's not the end of war. even the ongoing process does not mean end of war. It will be start of another insurgency or another kind of war, supported by who? All the stakeholders. I'm not going to touch upon those elements. So what should happen? Let's not call it a peace process at this stage. I think I go and call it, as Ambassador mentioned, Ambassador Nambiar, it's a political process, right? Because I distinguish, there's a clear distinction between peace and political processes, right? So, and the process is not going towards a peace process anymore. The process is going towards a political process, like in Turkey it happened, like in different parts of the world. So let's call it the political process. It suits it very well. With this process, it's good that there should be a third-party involvement. US is not a third party anymore. US is a party having interest in this process and had an interest from the beginning. A neutral third party would be, certainly UN is in the talk. UN could play a neutral third party, a platform where the region and the intra-Afghan process could be dealt in a way. And on the other hand, there should be also more focus on the Afghan settlement. And historically, Afghanistan war and peace has been seen from a regional lens or from a global power lens. All right, I think this time that everything should be homegrown, and homegrown political settlement, homegrown political process. And yes, the supporters are good. Today's world is connected. All countries in the world are connected and dependent on each other in one and other forms. Afghanistan can certainly have that role as well. But overall, I think the focus should be on the homegrown peace process. Political process. I don't want to use a peace process anymore. And a neutral platform or a neutral mediator, let's put it that way, a mediator that could at least facilitate this all stakeholders who are involved in the conflict and peace in Afghanistan. I think that would be the way, and I'm sure our negotiator are really in Doha to push on that. But the fear that I have is at this stage is there be lack of interest on the ongoing political process after U.S. troops withdrawal. And that will certainly will add more to the violence in the country. The scenario would be similar to kind of a civil war in the country, or maybe even, I don't want to name it civil war. There are all scenarios coming up, but at least that would add to the surge of violence if there would be lack of interest on the ongoing political process started in September of 2000 or October of 2018. I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Saki, for your insightful presentation. You highlighted a number of important areas as well as your own analysis of the scenario. We now move to Ambassador Amar Sinha, former Secretary, Ministry of External Affairs, India, and also a former Ambassador of India to Afghanistan. The floor is yours, Ambassador.
Thank you very much. Aran, as I had expected, that after four speakers, there'll be very little left to speak. And in fact, all four of them have covered very important aspects of the issue. Let me just address one part of it, perhaps, because you see, the first is the part of the violence. Why is the violence continuing in Afghanistan? What are the reasons and causes? Have those been addressed in the Doha Accord? And plus, what will be the regional geopolitics? Let me, rather than going into individual countries and how it will affect, let me tell you that the regional geopolitical sort of landscape will eventually arise out of two issues. First is, how is the American withdrawal is perceived? Is it perceived as a surrender, as an abandonment, as a defeat, and completely leaving the region or not? And that will affect the policies of many countries. And of course, what happens in Afghanistan. You see whether Taliban becomes part of the political dispensation peacefully, whether it is forcibly imposed on them, whether they want to grab power. So these are all factors which perhaps would define what will be the eventual geopolitical situation in the region, and it will also affect policies of the states. Till now, what we had seen was many of these policies were premised on very simple sort of objectives. Many countries just followed an anti-American policy, and that defined their Afghan policy in many ways. And that will also change once once the US withdraws. As far as the withdrawal itself is concerned, I think we should not be surprised. Any such intervention has to be temporarily, has to have a time limit. I think it is already 20 years. And one of the key factors which has fueled this conflict is getting sort of taken out of the scenario. So I personally feel that it's a great opportunity for the Afghans themselves to sit down and work towards peace. The problem is with the process itself, in terms of how the Doha Agreement was arrived at, these certain premises that were sort of driving it. What was the premise? The premise was that Taliban has changed. The Taliban is willing to sort of enter into negotiations with the Republican side and become part of a governing structure through power sharing agreement. That it had agreement promises that will cut links with regional terror groups, and which will no longer pose a threat to the West and particularly to the US. So these were some of the premises. Are they holding true? Unfortunately, they are not. My own assessment is that they are not. So that is why I want to focus on what is it that Taliban is trying to do. And you have seen that the nature, and I think Ms. Saki spoke about the nature and the correlationship between violence and different stages of this process. It is very clear that the violence is being used basically to completely delegitimize the current government and to send out a message that they in no way can protect the interest of the Afghan civilians. It is also, you can now see that there is a sectarian element coming into this violence. It is attacking all those forces, whether it is young students, journalists, even educated people randomly, anybody associated with the government, especially women judges, etc., which reflects a certain mindset of Taliban, which basically proves that they haven't changed really. And you see, today's debate, what I find is that people tend to think that Taliban was the norm in Afghanistan, or that is there's an either or sort of a choice. That if it is not the Republican government, as we have seen for the last 20 years, it is necessarily Taliban. I don't think if you actually look at Afghanistan or its history, that is correct. In fact, Taliban was never the norm. Taliban was an aberration. It came for a very specific period. It was imposed on the Kabul government. So to argue that as if the Republican system necessarily has to sort of cede to Taliban, it's an argument which doesn't hold good really if you look at Taliban history and the people who have lived there even before the Soviet intervention or Ambassador Nambiar in 1992. I guess what Taliban's vision is, I don't think that was the vision of Afghanistan, and it's not something that Afghan people accept. So you see, this sort of an imposition of a new ideology, a new way of living, a new religious code, first will not be accepted by the people. So we expect that before things cool down, one should see a lot of resistance and a lot of fighting. So withdrawal will not necessarily lead to peace. Other problem with the withdrawal is that the underlying factor behind this continued violence. You see, Taliban ultimately, while they could be very religiously motivated, where did they get the muscles and sinew to take on the international community, the strongest armies? That has not been addressed at all. At times it becomes politically or incorrect to speak the truth. But the fact is that the Taliban has operated out of Afghanistan. The false narrative that they are controlling 50%, 70% of Afghanistan needs to be dispelled. If they actually control 70% of Afghan territory, do you think the leadership will have to live in Quetta and Doha even today? If they actually control 70% of the country, they would be living there, not operating from sort of safe havens and resorts outside. So those are certain narratives that they are building. Of course, they have spent a lot of effort in building a certain narrative. And I don't think one necessarily has to be taken in by that. As far as the region is concerned, and one of the premises was that Taliban is a nationalistic force, doesn't have ambitions beyond Afghanistan. So, and plus it'll cut its links with other groups, and thus it'll be a factor for peace, I think has been completely belied and demolished by Taliban's own statement. And I'm actually rather surprised, and people have not talked about it. And it is so critical that one has to really, I would like to read it for your audience. The statement which came out on 26th of May, there could be different interpretation what it means, and I'll come to that. But just listen to the wording, which will basically take the bottom out of the main argument that Taliban is a totally Afghan force and it's not linked to international terror. Is this when they talked about US reports on US looking for bases in the region? What Taliban really has said that it will continue to have a veto on American decision where to base its military once it leaves Afghanistan. And it's interesting. I don't know if somebody of you all have read it, but it says that foreign forces are the root cause of insecurity and war in the region. Mind you, I'm putting emphasis. It doesn't say war in Afghanistan, war in the region. And the greatest tragedy is that everyone has witnessed in the last 20 years, especially our afflicted people, etc. Then they say that we urge neighboring countries not to allow and grant anyone such a concession. So far, so good. But look at the last part, which is, I think, menacing, which says, God forbid, if such a step is taken once again, it will be a great historic mistake and disgrace that shall forever be inscribed as a dark stain in history. And the Muslim and Mujahid nation of Afghanistan, presumably under their control, will not remain silent, but before such heinous and provocative acts, and it will fulfill its religious and historical responsibilities in the same way as it has performed throughout history. Now, Taliban's history is rather limited, so their making such exaggerated claims, I think, is going over the top. But worst is, it also then warns the regional countries that if such a step is taken, then the responsibility for all the misfortunes and difficulties lies upon those who commit such mistakes. Now, who would believe that this statement of Taliban doesn't say that they have regional ambitions? They not only have regional ambitions, they're telling Americans that you cannot even be present in Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, or of Pakistan. So they're actually challenging the region. And they're holding them responsible, that we'll hold you responsible, and we will fulfill our religious duty, which is jihad, in your land. Now, do you think Taliban has reach in all these countries? No. But obviously, they are referring to the network effect that they have because they are connected to the other terror groups in the region. So that's why I'm saying one has to read this. And I don't know why they have said it. Of course, the cynics have said that this could be a statement to put greater pressure on the Americans so that the Pakistanis can extract a larger sort of fee from the American for the basic rights or the rights of the bases. But importantly, if we just took it on face value, I think it points to Taliban saying that they have an underground network, their connections with various terror groups, including Al-Qaeda, and through which they will have a reach in the region beyond Afghanistan, so as to they could pursue American troops even there. So I think this is a very clear indication of what their intention is, and the fact that the entire premise that it only has Afghan interests in mind, or their interests are only centered in Afghanistan, I think it's a lie. So we should basically look for, I think, a prolonged period of no war but no peace for sure, because war here is defined as Taliban versus the rest. But ultimately, the civil war part, or the violence that they are inflicting on Afghan nation, I think they have no intention of reducing it till they achieve what they want. And their objective is very similar, that they want to come back in absolute control as in 1996, which, as I argued earlier, was not the default mode of Afghanistan nation. That was an aberration. But unfortunately, in today's narrative building, in the way we have legitimized Taliban, that seems to become the binary option, that if it is not the Republic, it is the Taliban. I think we need to change this narrative slightly. So I'll stop here and I'll discuss it later. And of course, I'd like to hear from Afghan people whether my assessment that this is not the real face of Afghanistan is correct at all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Sinha, for your excellent presentation and for the points that you raised. Our penultimate speaker is Mr. Ahmed Shuja Jamal, Director General of the Office of National Security Council of Afghanistan. Thank you for being here with us. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you also to the Tillotoma Foundation for organizing this very timely event. It's also very nice to see some old friends and colleagues, Dr. Sarabi, Dr. Sahi, Ambassador Sinha, Barney, and everybody else. Just a very small correction that I'm not the Director General of the Office of the National Security Council. I'm the Director General for International Relations and Regional Cooperation, a much more modest title than the one you gave me very generously. Thank you very much for your generosity. But to follow in the footsteps of the illustrious speakers earlier on the panel, I would like to take all of us back to maybe 6, 7, 8 years in Afghanistan, but also in the international community. When the former President Karzai spoke about the Taliban, he used a term that went down at that time in infamy. He used the term "our angry brothers" with respect to the Taliban. And not only did many people from the south and the east of the country rebelled against that term, but also everybody in the north, everybody in basically on the media, civil society, journalists, thought, how could you use the term angry brothers as in owning their acts of terrorism as an act of anger and a sort of a tantrum by a member of the family. Tantrums don't kill people. The Taliban's terrorism does. And so what you saw at that time was a knee-jerk reaction from the entire country against legitimizing the Taliban, bringing them in from the cold, and in some ways trying to sort of, I don't want to use the word downplay, but trying to make their terrorism more understandable and contextualizing them. Fast forward into 2014, which was the largest peace Loya Jirga, and fast forward to 2015, fast forward to today. Not a single national politician of national stature and renown is opposed to peace with the Taliban. That is a change. It's a sea change. It's a tectonic change. It's a change of 180 degrees. So what you're seeing is that in the past 6, perhaps 7 years, the domestic political consensus is almost entirely unanimous in favor of making peace with the Taliban. And that has actually coincided with a regional consensus in favor of bringing the Taliban in from the cold as part of an effort led by the United States, the Special Envoy, Ambassador Khalilzad. But what you're seeing, though, after the signing of the US-Taliban agreement in February of 2020, is that consensus is beginning to fray, not just in the international sphere, but also in the domestic sphere. Ever so slowly, but ever so perceptibly, the domestic consensus is beginning to show fissures and frays. The international consensus is beginning to show fissures and frays. The way this is manifesting itself, and before I go to how it's manifesting itself, let me tell you why it is manifesting itself in this way. The Taliban are either directly contributing to the to attacks against large regional connectivity infrastructure projects, be they in energy connectivity or rail connectivity, in which many countries in the region, such as Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan, have actually invested billions of dollars and 20 years of effort. And many other countries in the south, like Pakistan and India, have actually invested national hopes. The Taliban are either directly undermining and sabotaging these projects, or they're indirectly facilitating the undermining and sabotaging of these projects by creating an umbrella of insecurity under which not just other terrorist organizations, domestic and international, but also criminal networks can come and undermine large regional ambitions of South and Central Asia. And the continued use of terrorism and ever-escalating levels of Taliban violence is also beginning to show in the attitudes, the hardening attitudes of the region and the world. But it's also hardening the attitudes domestically of the Afghan people, who are only seeing the negative dividends of a peace effort led by Ambassador Khalilzad. They're only seeing increased terrorism and not decreased. They're seeing more insecurity and not less insecurity. They're seeing more power outages darkening the entire capital and not less of them. And so the Taliban's attitudes have also changed in how they treat Afghan delegates in international forums, all the way from Doha all the way to Moscow. And so what that is telling everybody is that the Taliban may be play acting an interest in peace. In some cases, they may have also successfully convinced the international community that they are interested in peace, but their actions, and not just in domestic sphere, but also actions that have regional repercussions, are speaking to the opposite of that. Which is why not only the Troika Plus format of countries have spoken out against the return of the emirate, but also the UN General Assembly, through its resolution number 2513, has actually spoken unequivocally and clearly against the return of an emirate. And most recently, I think it was in May, the 22nd of May or some thereabouts, the BRICS countries also issued their own statement in support of a democratic Afghanistan. What that shows all of us is that the regional consensus, which was unconditional with respect to bringing the Taliban in from the cold, is now beginning to sort of manifest itself. They're beginning to attach conditions about the return of the Taliban, which is they want the Taliban to return into a peaceful and not just a politically settled Afghanistan, a peaceful Afghanistan that is democratic and that can preserve the gains of the last 2 decades. Those are essential conditions that are being attached to the return of the Taliban by this country, but also by the region, by the UN Security Council. And so what that shows us is the continued intransigence and the use of ever-escalating levels of terrorism by the Taliban is hardening regional consensus, international consensus in favor of an unconditional return of the Taliban, but also fraying domestic consensus, because we are seeing people increasingly asking the question, what is in it for us in this peace process? And I think right now the Taliban are only facing the Afghan National Defense and Security Forces. It would be even harder when they see that people and communities are mobilizing on their own at the regional level and local level to oppose them. That is a process that would not only be detrimental to Afghanistan, but would also mean that the Taliban, through their intransigence, have denied themselves the most favorable conditions for making peace and coming in from the cold. And of course, like they've done for the past 20 years, they've also denied potentially Afghanistan and our generations to come a chance to live in peace and security and stability in this country. Because their continued use of violence and terrorism is being met by stiff resistance by ANDSF, but also continued support from the international community. The Afghan National Army Trust Fund, which funds the Afghan National Army, led by NATO, is actually fully funded until 2024. So there's no question about how much support they can receive. It is full support, funded and pledged until 2024. We're also actually signing regional security cooperations and bilateral security mechanisms with regional countries to strengthen some of that consensus. And so this is beginning to, like I said, to sort of summarize, the Taliban's intransigence is actually putting us at the precipice of losing an historic opportunity for the Taliban to come in from the cold, but also for Afghanistan actually to have a peaceful settlement in this country. We could always have a sort of a conversation about the role of individual actors in this region, which we think is still detrimental, but could be used positively, leveraged. But this is really a game changer for the Taliban to make an historic choice. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ahmed, Shuja, Jamal, for your analysis and for your presentation. We move now to the final speaker, Dr. Barnett Rubin, from a senior advisor to the U.S. Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan, U.S. Department of State, and a senior analyst of the region. So I request Dr. Rubin to state his presentations as well as to sort of summarize and analyze the presentations made by other speakers as well. Thank you so much, Dr. Rubin, for being here with us.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me and for organizing this fascinating session, which also, of course, as many people have said, is a reunion among old friends who have been separated by the pandemic for some time now. I'd like to start. I just want to ask Ahmad Shuja, when you spoke about the attacks on connectivity projects, were you referring in particular to the attacks on the electrical transmission lines in Baghlan, or are there other cases? If you would permit him to answer, because I know about those cases, but I wasn't that familiar with many cases of that.
Right. The attacks against our telecom, which is another form of regional connectivity, the attacks against railway projects, the workers who are involved in these railway projects, the attacks against other kinds of land connectivity that is happening across the country.
Sorry, I don't mean to make the question, but I didn't know about the attacks on railway projects. I mean, there used to be, there were attacks against the Indian workers and its protective forces who were building the road from Milak to the Ring Road, but I'm not familiar with the attacks on the railroad projects. I would wonder if you could just mention what those are.
Barney, thank you for that clarification question. There are attacks, but also ever-present threats against forces stationed to secure large multinational projects, including road connectivity, including investment by the international community to extract natural resources, and including the Afghan and international workers who go to and from these projects. So the attacks don't have to be about blowing up a bulldozer at Miss Ainak, but these attacks are also against the checkpoint stationed around Miss Ainak and around similar project that undermines investor confidence, but also increases the risk of that investment and the cost of it to the international community and to the Afghan people.
All right. Well, thank you for that. It's a very important factor, which I had not heard highlighted before, which I will certainly take into account in my own analysis. I thought I would start in a somewhat different way. You are all closer to Afghanistan than I am at this point, but I want to talk about the United States, because the United States is a major factor in this in this situation. And if we want to understand it, we have to we cannot just analyze Afghanistan or Afghanistan's neighbors, but we also have to understand changes that are taking place in the United States and its relationship to the region. So the first thing I want to point out is that when the U.S. troops, when the Soviet Union withdrew from Afghanistan in 1989, the economy of the United States was, measured by purchasing power parity, 4 times the size of the combined economies of all the countries of the region, including China, India, Russia, Iran, Pakistan. 4 times. As the United States is leaving Afghanistan, the economy of the United States is approximately equal in size to the economies of the region, those same countries that I mentioned, primarily, though not solely, because of the rise of China. Now, that is a tremendous shift in international relative power. The United States is not economically, in terms of the aid it can provide, the investment it can provide, nearly as powerful as it was in previous times. And that is affecting the entire environment in ways that we may not perceive. From the point of view of the United States as well, what are the threats that the United States perceives? Well, we have not had international terrorist attacks in quite some time. Of course, terrorists are active around the world doing various things, but there's very little evidence that they're intending to or able to hit the American homeland. Or even the attacks in Europe have decreased as well, largely, I would say, because of the defensive measures. And at the same time,
we are facing a number of other international security challenges, in particular the consequences of how to manage the rise of China, the increased assertiveness of Russia, which it sees as defensive, and so on, and the a very unfortunate and, in my view, to some extent unnecessary perpetual antagonism between the United States and Iran, all of which have potential negative consequences on Afghanistan. Second, there is second, third, whatever. The United States, even if to the extent that terrorism is still a threat, I think the predominant conclusion of our political thinkers, security analysts, is that military deployments are not a particularly effective way of protecting us against terrorism. That is, the whole idea of sending their troops somewhere to seek out the terrorists where they are before they come to the United States is basically flawed. In particular, it ignores the nature of the international system. And there also is we also greatly overestimated our, and I would say Europe's, ability to use aid, training, and military force to create institutions in other societies. Because if we look at the horrible attacks that are taking place now in Afghanistan, which some are characterizing as a genocide of Hazaras, whoever is carrying them out, the state is not able to stop them. And we can see that there are, in the Afghan military forces, the United States built up an Afghan military force, and I'm very pleased to hear that the trust fund is fully funded for 4 years. I also did not know that. That's very important. That means you can plan over a certain time horizon. But the U.S. also built a force in Afghanistan that is dependent on U.S. assistance, on U.S. military supply, and on U.S. contractors. For instance, take one example, helicopters. Afghan pilots had learned over many decades how to operate the originally Soviet, now more diffused MI system of helicopters, and particularly the Mi-17, and they knew how to maintain them and so on. Under U.S. supervision, the Afghan military has instead adopted helicopters from the McDonnell Douglas Corporation in Texas, which is located in a congressional district of a very powerful Republican member of Congress, and which are more expensive, and which Afghans are not trained in how to operate and maintain in the same way. And there are more, whereas both Russia and China have hundreds or thousands of decommissioned Mi-17 helicopters that Afghans know how to use and could be rehabilitated. Because Ambassador Sinha mentioned, why do the Taliban still have their headquarters outside the country if they control the territory? Well, the answer is they control 0% of Afghanistan's airspace. And so wherever they are in the territory, they can still be reached by air. So assuring that Afghanistan can continue to dominate that airspace is key to the future security of the country. Now, in terms of diplomatically, I think the United States has said that it will remain involved. It will continue to provide assistance that the Afghan state needs, because we should not forget for a moment that the Afghan state is dependent on assistance not only for the military, but for many, if not most, of the public services that it provides. And that is a structural characteristic of the Afghan state, not a characteristic of the current government in particular. The particular structures of dependency are different. But the question is, what is the United States willing and able to do internationally? I think, and when we talk about the region, of course, the problem is that there is no such thing as the region at this point. You know, Henry Kissinger was asked, what's Europe's telephone number? Actually, Europe does have a telephone number now, but the region around Afghanistan does not have a telephone number. Now, efforts are underway, very serious efforts, excuse me, to try to overcome that. But bear in mind that whatever the region does will have to be in cooperation with the United States, which, after all, even though its troops are gone, is still an indispensable partner of the Afghan security forces because of the military supply relationship and the maintenance requirements. So that we need Afghanistan will also need cooperation, not just within the region, which is difficult itself, but between the region and the United States. Now, as Ambassador Sinha mentioned, in a way, the most diplomatically active country in the region on the conflict in Afghanistan, at least before the start of the Doha negotiations led by Ambassador Khalilzad in 2018, was Russia with its Moscow process, which had succeeded actually in convening the region. And actually, Ambassador Sinha attended the meeting of the Moscow process on behalf of India in Moscow in November 2018. And so it was the first semi-official Indian presence at a meeting together with the Taliban, and therefore was thought to be an important marker of shifts in the region. Russia has paused the Moscow process during the U.S. negotiations, but certainly Ambassador Kabulov, their special envoy, has indicated that he intends to become active again. He held a meeting in Moscow recently, and he hasn't exactly announced his intentions, but I think we can say that, and certainly I was told last time I was in Moscow, which was in December 2019, the Moscow process is suspended, but it is not over, and it will be there if needed. Second, I want to mention China. Foreign Minister and State Councilor Wang Yi has been extremely active with respect to Afghanistan in the last several weeks, and recently issued a statement announcing the fourth meeting of the foreign minister trilateral of China, Pakistan, and Afghanistan, and has even appears to be arguing, if I understand his statements correctly, that China, Pakistan, Afghanistan trilateral cooperation it would be the centerpiece of a regional approach to Afghanistan. Now, this brings us to India, which of course is not a member of that. I think one of the most negative elements for peace in Afghanistan that has taken place in the region in the past few years has been the deterioration or really disappearance of the spirit of Wuhan. As you may remember, in, I believe, 2017, there was an informal summit between Prime Minister Modi and President Xi Jinping in Wuhan. And Wuhan, by the way, is the home city of a mutual friend of Ambassador Sinha and mine, Ambassador Luo Jiahui, who at that time was the ambassador to India and was probably the brains behind that rapprochement. And at that meeting, China and India discussed cooperation for the stabilization of Afghanistan. Well, I recently had the opportunity to raise that issue with Foreign Minister of India, Jai Shankar, and he said that, of course, since that time, a lot of water has flowed under many bridges. And in his recent discussions with China, they discussed only their very difficult bilateral relations and did not discuss their relations with any third countries. They no longer, apparently, the formula India China plus one is no longer active. And I know it's very difficult and against trends that are going on now, but I would say, for the sake of peace in the region, the United States started discussions with the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Richard Nixon started discussions with China at a time when it was called Red China and was really regarded as the biggest enemy of the United States. I would hope that India and China could start at least some back channel discussions, maybe as part of their attempts to control the situation on the border, about how they can facilitate what still are some common goals in Afghanistan. And there, I'll just end with this: the role of Pakistan is still very unclear. I mean, what the Taliban want is, of course, unclear, but Of course, you have to think the Taliban cannot do anything that they want. They can only do what they are capable of. And Pakistan has leverage over Taliban's capabilities precisely because their headquarters, logistics, and funding networks are largely located in Pakistan. Pakistan has been willing to get them to the negotiations, but not willing to pressure them inside Pakistan in a very decisive way that it could. And now there are press reports, media reports, that Pakistan is getting to the point where, with a potential settlement of sort in sights, which of course will not end all the violence, as Nilufar and others have said, but could decisively lower it and create the conditions for managing it. There are reports. I'm not saying they're true. I don't know. I've been trying to find out. I don't know, but there were that the Pakistan military has been putting much more serious pressure on the Taliban, saying that they might arrest their leaders if they do not actively participate in the negotiations and attempt to reach an agreement. And bear in mind that while in the 1990s, a Taliban regime did in fact give Pakistan strategic depth and enabled it to move troops away from the Afghan border and onto the Indian border and so on. That is no longer likely to be the case because a Taliban regime in Afghanistan is just as likely to give strategic depth to the TTP and other militant groups in Pakistan that are fighting against Pakistan. In addition to which, Pakistan's relationship with China is now much more important than it was in the 1990s. And China is clearly opposed to the return of the emirate and any kind of terrorist safe havens inside Afghanistan. So I would keep my eyes on the Pakistan-China relationship and what it bodes for Afghanistan. While, and this is just my suggestion for India as an outsider, my humble suggestion, which might not be received very well, an attempt to reopen the lines of communication with China about Afghanistan, because if Afghanistan becomes a forum not only for U.S. competition with Russia, China, Iran, and so on, not only for Pakistan-India rivalry, but for India-China rivalry. And I'm afraid that could again be fatal for the prospects for peace, stability, and all of those connectivity projects from which the nations of the region stand to benefit mutually. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rubin, for your presentation. I want to ask a question to Dr. Habiba Sarabi based on some of the questions that have been received. So I think Dr. Saki may also come in after Sarabi on this question. So the question is about the women's security, the security and the rights of women in Afghanistan. So what role do you think the United Nations can play, and also the civil society, for greater rights of women? And how do you look at the question of Taliban in this regard?
Thank you very much. The Taliban, they claim that they are respecting women's rights according to Islamic Sharia, but this Islamic rule in Islam Sharia is not very clear to everyone that which kind of Islamic rule they want for women's rights. Of course, they have been told about this education, but still when we go for the higher education, somehow they mention that there will be separate class for women or proper place for women for education. But you know that this separate class require a lot of resource. So Afghanistan, how Afghanistan can find this resource? It's a kind of boundary that most of the time they want for women to be separate, or at least want to this boundary. Of course, in the future, if the Taliban can control Afghanistan, women are very concerned about that inside Afghanistan. But the positive thing that women in the civil society, they are very united, they are mobilized, and the network that have been made among women inside the country, it's a kind of leverage that they are raising their price, and they have been, written several letters to the different organization or different address, even to the U.S. Congress for the women rights protection. These are something that women inside Afghanistan, they mobilize themselves. But for the international community, this is something that the women requesting or wanted, that the aid is coming in Afghanistan should be a kind of on base of precondition for women's rights and human rights. These are something that women inside in Afghanistan wanted to, from international community and also from the donor country and the US.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sarabi, for your answer. Thank you so much. I request hello, Dr. Rubin.
Yes, sorry, you were muted for a bit. I couldn't hear you.
Okay. So, Dr. Rubin, if you have questions for the other panelists, and then I can take some questions from Dr. Meena Singh Roy, head of a Western Central Asia Center. Yeah, go ahead.
One point that I neglected to make is, of course, that the UN Secretary General has appointed a personal envoy for Afghanistan and regional affairs, General Arnaud, who is currently traveling in the region, and he will make his way toward Afghanistan and India in due course. Up until now, he does not have a clear mandate. He has no mandate from the Security Council. And I would like to know from the other panelists whether they think that strengthening the mandate of the UN Special Envoy would be something that India would support, Afghanistan would support, that other countries of the region would support, and whether it might be one effective tool in trying to deal with this complex situation.
Yeah, Dr. Ambassador Nambiar, would you like to come in?
Well, I wouldn't want. I know Jean Arnaud quite well, and I think that he has been fairly effective as a special envoy. But I think this is something much more than the individuals, and I think the role of the UN at the present stage is going to be fairly nebulous. I don't think there can be very much that the UN can be seen to be doing. At the present moment, most of the action, as far as I can see, will be done by members of the P5 directly, particularly by Russia, China, and the US directly. And I don't know whether there is much scope at the present moment for the UN to lay down any basic parameters which can be adhered to by the Taliban itself. I don't see the Taliban as being even willing to adhere to any basic parameters vis-a-vis the UN, because as you can see, the UN has over the years been connected with many of the initiatives, particularly vis-a-vis civil society, the role of women, and things like that. And I'm not sure that the Taliban will really be willing to engage in these. It is important to keep these issues, in a sense, active, but I don't think that the UN can actually be expected to play a major role until the situation, in a sense, clarifies, at least in the course of a few months after the withdrawal of the United States. At least that's my impression.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Let me now quickly take request Dr. Meena Singh Roy, Head Western Central Asia Center, Tillotoma Foundation, to ask a few questions. Yeah.
Thank you, Soham. It is a pleasure to see all known people today participating in the conference here. I'm seeing Dr. Rubin after 2011, so I see a lot of change in you. I mean, after Istanbul, I think that was the time when we were talking about Iran's participation in the regional issues, and that was 2011. And today, we are discussing once again Afghanistan and its regional dynamics. My special thanks to Dr. Sarabi. You've accepted, and let me say, though Ambassador Jain Prasad is not here, I don't know if he's watching it, but he is instrumental in, getting me connected with you. Ambassador Amar Sinha, it's a pleasure to see you, and thank you for accepting the invitation. And General Nambiar comes very frequently to me because we worked very closely with him, and to you, sir. But I only have, I know the hard realities have been, unfolding today on ground, and all of you have addressed, these issues. But we really don't know how things are going to unfold in future. And I've always felt that this region, when we are looking at it, it has given us, strategic surprises. So I don't know what is the next strategic surprise that we are going to see in this part of the world. But I only hope that we will have some kind of a mechanism in place, which would lead to homegrown political process, if not a peace process. That is one. My question to all of you is that since there's so much of emphasis on, the regional actors and how, it will be left to the neighbors of the Afghanistan to deal with the situation. Given the problems and the challenges and the difference of opinions that, we see, and it's basically, one actor which would be very, very constructively involved. But how do we see, all regional actors coming and getting involved, constructively participating, looking at the interest of the Afghan people? Now, that I think is a very big question. And I would urge Dr. Rubin to say a few words. You are expecting probably too much from China. I really don't know. That's the sense I get, when I talk to some of the analysts in United States, that, you highlighted the economic weaknesses, the changing dynamics within United States, and of course, the impact of pandemic changing strategic landscape in the other region, and how US will have to reset its, outreach and its strategic, policies and interests that way. But I am not very sure, how effective would be the regional process. I have many I would say the factors that may not. But what I do see is there could be more sub-regional engagements depending on how you highlighted the trilateral cooperation. So China, Pakistan, Afghanistan, that is one. But how effective that can be. I think on part of India, I don't see that, India and China, have any difference of opinion as far as Afghanistan is concerned. But obviously, you don't want Taliban, and Ambassador Amar Sinha has very rightly pointed out their linkages with the global terrorist networks, and that's not going to go away so easily. And now, who can really put pressure on Taliban to change their course? That is what is the key question today. And as a woman, I would definitely, want some kind of a protection to the women of Afghanistan, the children of Afghanistan, the educational institutions, where so much of investments has come in. Now, who would provide that if not United States? Will there be any change given the increasing violence? And I don't think the Taliban are going to change the course in future unless they feel that there is pressure on them, and they are definitely emboldened in the present situation. So there are too many questions, but I don't know if there are any answers to those. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Singh Roy. I will take quick responses from Dr. Rubin first.
Well, I wouldn't say that I'm expecting a lot from China. The question is, from whom can one expect anything at this point? And my argument is that the United States is withdrawing. It has its military. It has fortunately maintained its other commitments, aid commitments. I don't know how long that will take place. The countries of the region do not have the option of withdrawing, which the United States does, because it is very far away. Its access to Afghanistan, which is landlocked, depends on those other countries. And bear in mind, I neglected to mention, the United States is also in internal turmoil. And we don't know what will happen in the next rounds of elections. We almost lost our democracy in January. And if that should repeat itself, that would change the strategic landscape as well. So I think rather than ask, can others do it besides the United States and hope the United States will do it, it is imperative for the countries that have no exit strategy to find ways to stabilize Afghanistan, hopefully with the United States, but even without the United States.
Thank you, Dr. Rubin. Ambassador Sinha, please.
Oops. Sorry,
Yeah,
I
we can
lost
hear you.
my mic. Yeah, correct. I was checking. No, I also believe that, that regional countries will have to play a bigger role. That is absolutely no doubt in that. And to expect that the Americans would have stayed here indefinitely was unrealistic. But the fact is that we are not seeing a sign for a peaceful reconciliation, because Taliban's first, of course, problem arises from the fact that they come from completely different worldview. Their view is not something that is shared by Afghanistan. They don't want to reintegrate, they want to replace, to say it simplistically. They want to replace their vision. Now, whether that will be acceptable, clearly no. Every country in the region, whether it's Iran, Russia, China, India, they have all said no, including US. A number of statements with the Troika, with Russia, with EU. So nobody wants that. So obviously, the international community feels that there is something valuable that was achieved in the last 20 years which needs protecting. And I think more than international community, it's the Afghans who feel that it is worth protecting. And obviously, so I see that there will be a huge amount of resistance. And as Mr. Shuja said, that it is one thing to be fighting the NDSF, but how do you fight the entire population which doesn't accept you? You see, submission to violence is not really acceptance of Taliban ideology. And I think from our perspective, it is very clear that yes, Taliban is, or the individuals in Taliban are members of the Afghan society. They have a right to come back and live peacefully. But that does not really mean that one accepts, or even the Afghans accept, the ideology of Taliban. So you have to distinguish between the individuals and the ideology. So I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you so much. I think I will ask a final question to Dr. Sarabi about the violence against different minority groups in Afghanistan, and what possible steps can be taken in the future, and about the very sort of alarming situation. Please unmute yourself.
Thank you. Unfortunately, minority group always is under threat, and especially during the Taliban. Of course, we were in a very bad circumstances, and still now. During these circumstances, also the minority group was under threat, and always facing with attack with the Taliban, and sometimes, of course. It's a kind of game between Taliban and also Daesh. But anyway, this because there's especially Hazara people, We are very prominent on the education. Always they are attacking the education center, the school, and so. The Hazara people around the world, they started some kind of campaign to bring other people with themselves for that campaign, and it should be a kind of pressure to Taliban. I wanted to touch upon to the issue of the women's, protection or women's rights, especially on education. Of course, within this 20 years, the U.S. was on the top that for the supporting the Afghan people, especially women. But there were so many other countries that supporting women or giving protection to women, from the European country up to the U.S. and also the Asia. For example, the India giving, every year 50 scholarship for the children or for the women and girls, and also for the boys in Afghanistan. For example, my nephew is now studying in India, so many other women studied in India. This is a kind of support. For example, my daughter started the bachelor degree in India, and after that went to United States to take another degree. So this is a kind of support that we are getting from the international community all over the world, and we are very we are appreciating that. I'm still sure that the international community will not stop the support for the girls' education, for women protection, for women's rights, and human rights, and the freedom of expression, because it's a kind of universal value. The universal value always getting support from international community, and I believe to that. Of course, sometimes it was during 90s, it was not getting support from international community, but this time all the international community are they committed to support Afghan people. Thank you very much, and please my warm regard to Ambassador Dr. Shuja.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Thank you to all of you. We now conclude this international seminar on continued violence in Afghanistan and regional geopolitical implications of the U.S. withdrawal, organized by the Tillotoma Foundation. Thank you to everyone, to all the viewers from across the world. Thank you to all the esteemed speakers. Thank you so much for joining.